What happens when one of the world's most respected rock icons goes head-to-head with late-night television's most notorious host? You won't believe what unfolds when a simple interview turns into an explosive confrontation that has everyone talking. Tonight we witnessed something unprecedented. A collision between artistic integrity and entertainment cynicism that ended with one of music's biggest legends walking away in disgust. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when Jimmy Kimmel pushes the wrong button with the wrong guest. The stage was set for what should have been a routine promotional appearance. Bono, the legendary frontman of U2, had agreed to appear on Jimmy Kimmel Live to discuss the band's latest charitable initiatives and their upcoming documentary about climate activism. What started as standard late-night fare quickly devolved into something far more sinister. A masterclass in how not to interview a guest who's dedicated decades of their life to making the world a better place. From the moment Bono walked onto that stage, something felt different. The usual warmth that characterizes most celebrity interviews was noticeably absent. Kimmel's opening remarks carried an edge that seasoned viewers immediately picked up on. Instead of the typical enthusiastic "Welcome," there was a palpable tension hanging in the air like a storm cloud waiting to burst. "So Bono," Kimmel began with that trademark smirk that his fans love but his critics find insufferable, "here you are again, telling us all how to save the world. Must be exhausting being humanity's moral compass." The audience laughed, but Bono's expression remained steady, professional. He'd clearly encountered this type of cynicism before. "Well, Jimmy," Bono responded with measured composure, "I think when you've seen what I've seen in places like sub-Saharan Africa, when you've held children who are dying from preventable diseases, it becomes less about being a moral compass and more about being human." His Irish accent carried weight that seemed to momentarily silence even Kimmel's prepared quips. But Kimmel wasn't finished. This is where things started to take a turn that nobody in that studio audience could have predicted. Instead of acknowledging the gravity of Bono's work or pivoting to lighter topics, Kimmel doubled down with a question that would prove to be the first crack in what would become a catastrophic interview. "Right. But let's be honest here," Kimmel continued, his voice taking on that patronizing tone that regular viewers know all too well. "How much of this activism is really about helping people, and how much is it about Bono the brand? I mean, you've been doing this saint act for what, 30 years now? That's pretty good for business, isn't it?" The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Bono's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his media training kicked in. "Jimmy, I understand cynicism sells in your world, but the mothers I've met who can now afford medication for their HIV-positive children because of our work, they're not concerned about brands or acts. They're concerned about staying alive." What happened next revealed the true character of both men. Instead of recognizing that he'd crossed a line, instead of showing even basic respect for his guest's humanitarian efforts, Kimmel seemed to interpret Bono's measured response as weakness. His eyes lit up with the predatory gleam of someone who smells blood in the water. "Oh, come on," Kimmel pressed, leaning forward with that aggressive body language that his producers probably coach him to use for compelling television. "You fly around in private jets lecturing people about climate change. You hang out with billionaires and politicians while singing about the poor. Don't you see the irony? Or is the irony part of the brand too?" The studio audience, initially amused by what they thought was playful banter, began to sense the shift. The laughter became more nervous, more scattered. Even Kimmel's loyal fans seemed uncomfortable with the direction this was heading. But their host was just getting started. Bono's response was measured, but those who know him could see the fire building behind his trademark sunglasses. "Jimmy, I've never claimed to be perfect, but I've also never claimed that imperfection should be an excuse for inaction. Yes, I travel extensively. Because that's how you reach world leaders. That's how you negotiate aid packages. That's how you save lives." If you think that work is somehow invalidated by the carbon footprint it requires, then perhaps you misunderstand the mathematics of human suffering. The eloquence of that response should have given Kimmel pause. Any decent interviewer would have recognized they were in the presence of someone operating on a completely different intellectual and moral level. But this wasn't about decent interviewing anymore. This had become something else entirely. Kimmel had tasted controversy, and he wanted more. The mathematics of human suffering, Kimmel repeated mockingly, his voice dripping with sarcasm. That's beautiful, really. Very poetic. Did you workshop that line with your publicist? The audience grew quieter still, sensing they were witnessing something that went beyond entertainment into genuinely uncomfortable territory. But Bono wasn't backing down, and this is where viewers could see the steel beneath the humanitarian exterior. No, Jimmy. I learned that phrase sitting in hospital wards in Malawi, watching children die while medicines that could save them sit in warehouses because of patent disputes and political gridlock. You want to talk about workshopping lines? Let's talk about the courage it takes to look a dying child's mother in the eye and promise her you'll fight for change, knowing that cynics like you will question every motive, every method, every outcome. The temperature in that studio had shifted dramatically. What started as a celebrity interview had become something approaching a philosophical battleground, with Kimmel representing the worst of American entertainment cynicism and Bono embodying decades of genuine commitment to global justice. The collision between these worldviews was creating exactly the kind of tension that would soon explode into something unprecedented. Kimmel, perhaps realizing he was losing the room but too committed to his attack to back down, decided to escalate further. His next question would prove to be the point of no return, the moment when a bad interview transformed into something that would dominate headlines and social media discussions for days to come. The anticipation in that room was electric, and everyone present knew they were about to witness something that would be talked about for years. "Let me ask you something else, Bono," Kimmel said, his voice taking on a darker edge that even his most controversial moments hadn't touched before. All this talk about saving Africa, about being this great humanitarian. But what about the allegations? What about the reports of financial mismanagement in your one campaign? What about the criticism that barely 10% of the money raised actually reaches the people you claim to help? The studio fell into complete silence. This wasn't just aggressive interviewing anymore. This was character assassination on live television. Even Kimmel's band leader looked uncomfortable, and the camera operators seemed unsure where to focus, as the tension reached a breaking point that nobody had anticipated. Bono's entire demeanor changed in that moment. The measured diplomat disappeared, replaced by something far more dangerous. A man whose life's work was being publicly questioned, based on manufactured controversy and deliberate misinformation. When he spoke, his voice carried a quiet intensity that made every person in that room lean forward. "Jimmy, I'm going to give you one opportunity to retract that question and apologize," Bono said, removing his sunglasses for the first time during the interview. His eyes were blazing with controlled fury. "Because what you just said isn't journalism, it isn't entertainment, it's slander. And it's based on thoroughly debunked reports that were created by people with political agendas who wanted to undermine our work." But Kimmel had crossed the Rubicon now, and there was no going back. Instead of recognizing the gravity of what he'd just done, instead of understanding that he'd just accused one of the world's most respected humanitarians of corruption on national television, he doubled down with a viciousness that shocked even his own production team. "Oh, so now I'm supposed to be scared?" Kimmel shot back, his voice rising with mock indignation. "The great Bono is going to what? Sue me? Write a song about me? Look, I'm just asking the questions that people are thinking. If you can't handle legitimate scrutiny of your organization's finances, maybe you're in the wrong business." The word legitimate hung in the air like a slap. What Kimmel had just done wasn't legitimate scrutiny. It was a calculated attack. using discredited information, and everyone in that room knew it. The audience had gone from uncomfortable to genuinely disturbed. Several people could be seen shaking their heads, and at least one audience member appeared to be getting up to leave. Bono stood up from his chair, a move so unexpected that it sent a ripple of gasps through the studio. For a moment, it looked like he might walk off the stage right then and there, but instead he did something that would be replayed millions of times on social media. He stepped closer to Kimmel's desk, looked directly into the camera, and addressed the audience with a passion and authenticity that cut through the studio's manufactured atmosphere like a knife. "Ladies and gentlemen," Bono said, his Irish accent becoming more pronounced as his emotions intensified, "I want you to understand what you just witnessed. Your host just repeated lies, demonstrably false information, about an organization that has helped secure over $20 billion in aid for the world's poorest countries. Information that was proven false by independent auditors, by investigative journalists, by anyone who cared enough to look at the actual facts." The power in that moment was extraordinary. Here was a man who had negotiated with world leaders, who had stood before the United Nations, who had dedicated his life to fighting poverty and disease, being forced to defend his integrity against baseless attacks from a talk show host more interested in viral moments than truth. "The One campaign," Bono continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, "has a 93% efficiency rating. 93% of every dollar donated goes directly to programs that save lives. But your host doesn't care about facts. He cares about ratings. He cares about controversy. He cares about tearing down anyone who dares to suggest that we can make this world better." Kimmel, perhaps finally realizing the magnitude of his miscalculation, tried to regain control of the situation. But his attempt at damage control only made things worse. "Hey, look, I'm just doing my job here. It's called holding people accountable. If you can't take the heat, maybe you should stick to making music instead of pretending to be some kind of political leader." The phrase "pretending to be" was the final straw. Bono turned back to face Kimmel directly, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of every sleepless night spent negotiating debt relief, every hospital visit to dying children, every meeting with world leaders who initially dismissed him as just a rock star until his knowledge and passion won them over. Pretending? Bono's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried more power than if he had shouted. "Jimmy, I've spent the last 25 years of my life learning about macroeconomics, about international development, about pharmaceutical patents and trade agreements, and debt restructuring. I've sat across from finance ministers and central bank governors and pharmaceutical executives, fighting for policies that save lives. I've held dying children in my arms and promised their mothers I would fight for them. And you think I'm pretending?" The studio audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Even Kimmel's most loyal fans seemed to understand that they were witnessing something extraordinary: the complete moral annihilation of their host by someone operating on an entirely different level of human decency and commitment. But Kimmel still wasn't finished. In what would prove to be his most catastrophic decision of the evening, he chose to attack not just Bono's work, but his motivations at the deepest level. His next words would trigger the explosive finale that everyone would be talking about. "For months to come." "You know what I think?" Kimmel said, his voice taking on a sneering quality that revealed the absolute worst of his character. "I think this whole saint act is just guilt. Rich rock star feels bad about his success, so he goes to Africa to make himself feel better. It's therapy, not activism. And now you can't handle anyone questioning your little guilt trip charity project because deep down, you know I'm right." The words hit the studio like a physical blow. Several audience members audibly gasped. Even Kimmel's own band looked stunned by the cruelty of the attack. But what happened next would transform this from a controversial interview into a legendary moment of television that would be studied and debated for years to come. Bono stood, completely still for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 seconds. The silence in that studio was deafening. You could hear the hum of the cameras, the barely audible whisper of the air conditioning, the nervous shuffling of feet from the production crew who were witnessing their host commit professional suicide. On live television, when Bono finally spoke, his voice was different. Gone was the diplomatic tone, the measured responses, the patient explanations. What emerged was something raw and powerful, the voice of a man who had reached his absolute limit with cynicism masquerading as entertainment. "Guilt?" Bono said, and the single word carried more weight than entire speeches. "You think this is about guilt?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Only a bitter recognition of just how fundamentally Kimmel had misunderstood everything about him. Everything about the work. Everything about what it means to care about something bigger than yourself. "Jimmy, let me tell you about guilt," Bono continued, his voice rising with an intensity that commanded every person in that room. "Guilt is sitting in your comfortable studio, making millions of dollars by mocking people who are trying to make a difference. Guilt is using your platform to spread lies about organizations that are saving lives because you think it makes for good television. Guilt is being so empty inside, so devoid of purpose, that you can't imagine someone might actually care about strangers on the other side of the world without some selfish motive behind it." The studio audience was completely transfixed. This wasn't just a celebrity getting angry. This was a master class in moral authority destroying someone who had confused cynicism with intelligence, cruelty with wit. "You want to know what guilt looks like?" Bono pressed on, his voice gaining power with each word. "Guilt is watching a mother bury her child because she couldn't afford 20 cents worth of medicine, then coming home to your mansion and doing nothing about it. Guilt is knowing that you have the power to influence millions of people, and using that power to tear down rather than build up." Kimmel tried to interrupt, his face reddening as he realized the interview had spiraled completely, beyond his control. "Now wait just a minute." "No, Jimmy, you wait." Bono cut him off with such authority that even Kimmel fell silent. "You've had your say. You've made your accusations. You've questioned my motives, my integrity, my life's work. Now it's my turn." What happened next was extraordinary. Bono turned away from Kimmel entirely and addressed the camera directly, speaking to the millions of viewers watching at home with a passion and authenticity that reminded everyone why he had become one of the most respected voices of his generation. "To everyone watching tonight," Bono said, looking directly into the camera lens, "I want you to understand something. There are people in this world who believe that caring is weakness, that compassion is performance, that anyone who tries to make a difference must have some hidden agenda because they can't imagine genuinely caring about anything beyond themselves." The camera operators, sensing they were capturing something historic, kept their focus tight on Bono as he continued. "But I've seen what happens when people do care. I've seen villages get clean water for the first time. I've seen children survive diseases that would have killed them just years before. I've seen governments change policies that save millions of lives. And yes, I've seen rock stars become activists, because sometimes the loudest voice is the one that gets heard." Kimmel, perhaps finally understanding the magnitude of his mistake, tried one last desperate attempt to regain control. "Look, Bono, I think you're taking this a little too—" But Bono had heard enough. He turned back to face Kimmel one final time, and when he spoke, his words carried the finality of a judge delivering a verdict. "Jimmy, in 25 years of advocacy work, I've been criticized by politicians who disagreed with my methods, by activists who thought I was too moderate, by business leaders who thought I was too radical. But I have never, ever been attacked with such willful ignorance, such deliberate cruelty, such complete disregard for truth as I have been tonight on your show." The weight of those words settled over the studio like a heavy blanket. Even Kimmel's most ardent supporters in the audience looked uncomfortable, sensing that their host had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. "You know what the difference is between us, Jimmy?" Bono continued, his voice now calm but carrying unmistakable steel. "When I go to sleep tonight, I'll think about the thousands of people who are alive today because of work that organizations like One have done. The mothers who didn't lose their children to preventable diseases. The communities that have clean water and education and hope for the future." He paused, letting the words sink in before delivering the final blow. "When you go to sleep tonight, you'll think about ratings, about whether this controversy will trend on social media, about whether attacking someone who's devoted their life to helping others will get you more viewers tomorrow night. And that, Jimmy, is the difference between someone who actually cares about making the world better and someone who just pretends to care about entertainment." With that, Bono began removing his microphone. The simple act of unclipping the small device and placing it on Kimmel's desk carried more dramatic weight than any scripted moment could have achieved. The studio was so quiet that the soft click of the microphone hitting the desk echoed through the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Bono said, addressing the audience one final time, "thank you for listening. Thank you for caring about something bigger than yourselves. And thank you for understanding the difference between someone who builds and someone who just tears down." He turned and began walking toward the exit, his stride confident and purposeful. But just before he reached the edge of the stage, he stopped and turned back one last time. What he said next would become the most quoted line from the entire confrontation. "Jimmy, I genuinely hope that someday you find something worth caring about more than your own cynicism. The world needs more builders and fewer demolition crews." And with that, Bono walked off the stage, leaving behind a stunned studio audience, a humiliated host, and a piece of television that would be analyzed and discussed for years to come. The remaining cameras caught Kimmel sitting at his desk, speechless for perhaps the first time in his career, as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. The audience didn't know whether to applaud or sit in silence. Some began, clapping slowly at first, then building to sustained applause as they processed what they had witnessed. Others remained quiet, still absorbing the moral reckoning they had just seen unfold. As Bono disappeared through the studio exit, he left behind more than just an empty chair and a shocked talk show host. He had delivered a masterclass in dignity, under attack, in moral authority triumphing over cynical entertainment, and in what happens when someone with genuine purpose encounters someone who mistakes cruelty for cleverness. The interview was over, but the conversation it started would continue long after the cameras stopped rolling.